Hey guys, Costa here, and in today's video I'm going to be continuing this new series I'm doing analyzing games from our Patreon page. If you missed the previous video, I kind of introduced this new series back then, so make sure to check that out. But for this video, I'm going to be looking at a game submitted from Jimmy, another one of our Patreon subscribers. And this is one of Jimmy's old over-the-board games. He's around 1600 USCF rating, and his opponent in this game is much higher rated, 2300. And I think my main takeaway from this game was that Jimmy does a few things that are kind of indicative of what happens when you go up against a higher rated player and you end up feeling like you're under a lot of pressure. So I think a really interesting game to go over, and props to Jimmy for submitting a loss, to fully learn from. So the game starts off with c4, black plays knight f6, white goes g3, and opts for this kind of English setup, putting the bishop on g2. And actually there's already some interesting moments in the opening. Black here plays d5, and I was already surprised that white didn't simply just take on d5 here. Normally in the English, the idea is that we do want to take on d5 when the opponent is forced to take back with the piece, because it means that white is going to be left with an extra pawn in the center. It's kind of like a reverse Sicilian idea. It's a very similar theme comes up for black in the open Sicilian as well. Here queen takes d5 is nothing to worry about for white. White can just play knight f3 here, followed by knight c3, and basically white has a good version of these English kind of lines. And instead, that's why black often starts with a move like c6 or e6 in this position. If they want to play a Slav setup, then definitely c6, so that when they play d5, they can recapture with the c-pawn and kind of keep their equal control over the center. So a bit of, I think, a miss there by white not to just take on d5 and get kind of a pleasant structure. Instead, white goes bishop g2, black plays c6, and now Jimmy takes on d5. And he writes in his notes, I think I hand over any opening edge I might have with this move. I simply couldn't remember the lines after knight f3. Some let you keep the pawn, and some I'm able to recapture pretty easily. And they look pretty similar, but if I choose the wrong plan, then I would simply be down the pawn for nothing. And I can totally get that, and especially against a high-rated player, you do kind of feel this pressure where, like, if you just casually leave your pawn hanging with a move like knight f3, you are worried a little bit that maybe they're just going to take the pawn and hold on to it, and like you're not going to be able to regain it. So this is like a typical thing that happens to players, I think, when they go up against a higher rated opponent, is that they don't really believe in their lines all of a sudden. Even though maybe Jimmy has spent some time looking at these positions, all of a sudden he's nervous, he's not sure it's going to work out. And that's a bit of a shame, because it's like, well, then why look at the opening at all, right? Why study it if you're not going to go into the most critical lines for the games that it really counts? So it feels like we kind of play it safe a little bit with c takes d5. Just hoping to simplify the structure and get something solid where there's not any tension. But of course, this makes black's life a lot easier, because what happens after cd is that black's knight on b8 gets this fancy c6 square. Okay, it's not that fancy, it's actually just a very good square, a very normal square in the center. And the point is that if white is able to wait, let's say with a move like knight f3, and black goes knight d7 here, well, now when white takes on d5, which still isn't forced, but is definitely on much better terms, the knight on d7 is much more passive than it would be on c6. Now here it's kind of blocking the bishop. It doesn't really have a bunch of good squares to jump to, and white is just going to be slightly, maybe even clearly better in these kinds of positions. But again, white does not necessarily even have to take on d5. You can definitely keep the tension for much longer. So what to do on dc4? Well, indeed, white does win the pawn back. You have moves like queen c2 and knight a3 here, and knight a5 and knight e5, and you might even throw in a4 first. But the point is that this is something that should have been really worked out at home. If you're going to play this line where you're like sacrificing a pawn, you need to have the confidence to then show up and be willing to do it, and knowing exactly what you're going to get for the pawn or how you're going to get the pawn back. And then by all means, go and enjoy and play the line and be aggressive and really go for the kill. That's exactly how we should be playing against high-rated players. We should be trying to challenge them with our best openings and really putting them under pressure rather than trying to always release the tension and actually making things easier for the opponent in the process. So CD, CD, knight f3 is played. Now black plays, I would say, a somewhat solid but also slightly passive setup, and basically we get normal position here after d4. Now black starts messing around a little bit with bishop to d7. I think white correctly goes knight e5 and starts taking some space. Bishop c6, and white just continues developing here, bishop f4. Very smooth and nice move. And now black actually has an issue here and goes bishop to c7. And why does black play bishop c7? Well, if black continues developing, let's say normally with knight bd7, then there's actually a hanging bishop on d6, and white just immediately wins with knight takes c6. Hitting the queen, grabbing a piece, black recaptures, white wins the bishop on d6, and it's just game over. So already here, black is actually experiencing a little bit of difficulties because he can't develop his knight to the most natural square. Knight a6 doesn't really make a ton of sense in this position. The knight is not going to be well placed there. So he goes bishop to c7, hoping to prepare knight d7 and challenge white on the e5 square. And now white goes ahead and takes on c6 and takes on c7, and immediately, well, all of a sudden black is just completely developed here. Rooks are connected, all the pieces are out, and black's position compared to just 2 moves ago has greatly improved. So what happened? So once again, white kind of relieves the tension. He grabs the bishop pair, which at first feels kind of ambitious, but then immediately trades off one of the bishops. Now white's bishop pair is not really an advantage at all. And if anything, white's bishop on g2 is very, very restricted in this structure, but kind of biting on granite against this d5 pawn. So what should white have done? Well, white should have looked for a way to keep the tension and improve his position. I think rook c1 clearly comes to mind, just getting the rook in. The knight can always draw back to d3. And I would say especially it's not exactly the thing we want to do here is trading off black's light square bishop. It is a very, very passive piece. The position is likely to be more of a closed nature, and so the knights here could be good, and yeah, this bishop can one day become kind of a bad bishop that white can play again. So I think taking on c6, especially allowing the opponent to then develop a knight that black was kind of struggling to develop, definitely seems like we're just completely giving up all of the tension, all of the pressure in the position, and making black's life much easier. So here black ends up actually getting a really nice position. White kind of errs here with rook c1, forgetting about queen to b6 with kind of unfortunate double attack here. Instead, had white played e3, I think the position would have remained pretty close to equal. So rook c1, queen b6, white decides to give up the b2 pawn. Interestingly enough, the engine actually suggests b3 here, and I totally understand the instinct to give up the b2 pawn, and honestly I probably would have just done the same thing. But Stockfish's point after b3 is quite interesting. Number one, knight takes d4 is not so great after knight a4. Black's queen is hanging, and black has a hard time hanging onto the knight and is losing material. And after queen takes d4, white actually gets a fair bit of play after trading queens, rook fd1, let's say kicking the knight back, and then very important pawn break e4. Just completely opening up the diagonal here. Now white is fully mobilized, the rooks are active, and most importantly, the bishop is actually putting some pressure on this diagonal. White has gotten probably the most important move in the position in e4. So if black takes a couple times on e4, then white clearly has a bunch of pressure on c6, and the rook is coming into d7. White definitely has enough compensation here for at least equality. And if black tries something like d4, then white can play like knight e2 or knight b5, but I really like this move e5. Just again opening up the bishop, and then on knight e5, rook takes d4. White is still down a pawn, but the bishop is wide open, the rooks are active, and yeah, white has a lot of compensation here for the pawn and should have very, very good chances here to at least equalize, if not more. So that's kind of a really cool point, but again, I totally understand the instinct to defend the center pawn and give up the b2 pawn and kind of look for a little bit of compensation this way. Unfortunately for white, black just ends up being too solid here. And I would say black plays quite well to kind of build the advantage until we get to a critical moment later on that I thought was pretty interesting. So we trade off a bunch of rooks here. White tries to just keep everything steady, but black is maneuvering, puts the knight on c4, starts pushing the queen side here with a5, and basically does everything right, pushes b4, queen e7. And here black starts to, let's say, really push for the win, e5, e4, bishop e2, and now g5. And this move definitely struck me as being a little bit unusual. Black, of course, has a very big advantage. I'll just flip the board here real quick. Extra pawn and like really dominating knights on c4. It's not the easiest position to win here, but this is one where black has to kind of slowly improve, maybe try to get it into an endgame, and one day hopefully maybe land the knight on c3, get after that a2 pawn, and win on the queen side. And g5 I think is not terrible in spirit, but what it ends up doing more than anything is actually just opening up black's king. So black doesn't really get any new targets for the queen and knight. He's not really threatening to sack on e3 in many cases. Instead, all black has done is opened up the g file, and that actually ends up giving white some chances later on. So I think Jimmy holds on really well here with knight d2. Now black plays queen to d8. Apparently black here missed that. It could have just immediately gone for knight a4, knight to c3. But just like that, black misses one idea. And now white actually has good chances of setting up counterplay. So queen c2. Not sure about this one. I think maybe white missed the response, queen c8, because, yeah, definitely white doesn't want an endgame here. Any kind of endgame is bad. The knight just immediately comes back to a4, c3, and that looks very passive for white's bishop. So white avoids the queen trade, queen to d1, but now latches on to the right square for the queen, where it's always looking to infiltrate the king side and create some counterplay against black's king. So here black plays queen to c3. White has a choice here, ends up choosing wrong, plays the move bishop to h5. After bishop b5, the main difference here is that white is not only threatening queen g4 check with some counterplay, but also wants to just come in with queen to h5. So black here might have nothing better than queen to c8 covering the g4 square. But then white comes in with queen h5 and immediately has lots and lots of counterplay in the position. And yeah, black is going to have to work very, very hard to actually win this one. Instead, bishop h5 is played, queen to c8. And then here Jimmy kind of goes a little bit crazy here and takes on f7. And I say it goes a little bit crazy because I feel like this was really not necessary. White still had lots of chances to create counterplay, even though there's no immediate way to give a check, but white could still maneuver here or play bishop g4, lots of different ideas. But instead white goes for bishop takes f7, kind of a crazy sack, because what ends up happening is, well, black's king runs to the queen side, and it feels like white got, two pawns for the piece, but not really, because if we look at the resulting position, all white got was this one, g pawn. So white's one possibility here is, maybe he can run the g pawn up one day, but that feels very slow. Is that worth more than a bishop? Probably not, right? And yeah, black ends up winning this one without having to put in as much effort as he probably needed to, in some of the other positions. So white gives some more checks, but queen e6, of course, white cannot trade queens here. And in general, I would say when you're going for a perpetual, if you're not able to trade queens, then yeah, it's a good chance it's simply not going to work out. Black's queen just blocks the checks. And what can you do? Black is an extra knight. Now white is able to pick up this one pawn on a5, but it's not really enough. Black goes queen to d6. White fights for some counterplay with the g-pawn, but black finds a very nice plan here, bringing the knight into f3, just utilizing the knight to its kind of maximum potential, going after white's king and combining with the queen to create some devastating mating attacks. So white continued here. I think these last few moves are actually just kind of approximate, but essentially black came in and ended up mating white on the back rank. Not too surprising given that black now has this extra piece, and yeah, queen comes in very actively. White's queen has to be kind of supporting the pawn and neglecting the king, and yeah, what can you do? We kind of ended up here. So really interesting game, and I think highlights kind of typical experience when you're going up against a high-rated player. You, number one, rarely feel confident sacrificing material, and we often want to just release the tension, even in situations where it's better to keep the tension, just keep the pressure, keep your position active. And then this last, let's say, mistake with bishop takes f7, I would say this is something that actually happens as well, because this is in a way white releasing the tension as well. Instead of keeping pieces on the board and trying to just find another route for the attack, white immediately tries to decide things with bishop takes f7, hoping that this leads to some kind of perpetual or some kind of resolution, but of course it doesn't, and all white ends up doing is just leaving the opponent with an extra piece. So kind of an unfortunate mistake, but hopefully one we can all learn from. So thank you, Jimmy, for submitting the game. That's going to wrap it up for this video. Hope you guys found it instructive. If you did, please let us know in the comments section below, and I'll catch you guys next time for the next Patreon game analysis. Take care.